Well, good afternoon. It's good to see you again. It's a Sunday afternoon here, and I just thought I'd pick up where we last left off on Revelations, and I'm just going to start in chapter 6 again about the four horsemen. Seems to be a popular thing people like to say from time to time in movies and stuff. People make jokes about it, but it's of course not a very funny thing to talk about when you see how serious it is. But yeah, again, it's just nice to be here and to be talking with you again. I enjoyed the last time we spoke, and I'm still getting used to looking at the camera here and not the screen. But yeah, I've got some notes here today and just want to talk to you about different points. So let's just get right into it. And I've got my Bible here. Best place to start when we sit down and talk about the Word of God. And so it seems to be, in my opinion, that today's world looks like we're preparing for the black horse in talked about in Revelation 6. We're either in that time frame or we're coming into it, and it looks like to me when I read the Bible, it looks like those two horses, the black and the pale, it looks like their time frames are not as long as the two previous horses, and they don't have to be, right? I mean, there's God's in charge of the time, so. Yeah, so when I talk about the black horse, I'm talking about, well, let's just pick up right here. Let's just get right into it, actually. And we'll just skip right to the back here. All right. So it says here, the fourth seal, or the third seal it's called, says chapter 6 verse 5, then he opened the third seal, and I heard a living creature say, come and see. So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on the pair of scales in his hand. And and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. So we're going into a period where there's a lot of financial trouble. And, they're saying that since 2008, the governments of the world have been living off of borrowed money. Last year, there was a lot of talk about Europe going through their quantitative measures, as they call it, and or quantitative easing, and they're trying to find a way of dealing with their debt. And now we've got governments all over the world with a lot of debt, a lot of problems, and it seems to be that the governments are just trying to spend money to keep the economy going, like infrastructure. You see a lot of, in Canada, we see a lot of roads and being worked on, and bridges and really nice projects, for sure. And it's nice to see all this stuff get done. And then all that money spent gets trickled down into the economy. People's homes are basically being renovated, and people have money because the government's spending money in big projects, which is going into people's salaries, which goes into people's lives, and so on and so forth. And so you see just a kind of like a problem that's kind of being put under the carpet, so to speak. But the problem is that there's just so much debt. It's said that the United States government has, I guess they're saying $17 trillion in debt, but that's on the books. Then there's all this black book spending, which is, they're saying, you know, in and around the $70 trillion mark. So it's bigger than what's on the books, right? And that's all these, secret projects. Now I watched a fellow on the internet a while back, probably a year or two ago, and he's a Canadian journalist, and he spoke about how the Canadian dollar, is being basically generated, um, for lack of a better term, by all the banks in our country. So we've got 3 or 4 really big banks, and so they print the money, and the government pays them something like between 10 and 15 cents uh, for every dollar generated. So but the problem is that money never really gets paid back. So we've got exponential debt that basically gets generated every year and not completely paid off. And so and that's same system, I believe, um, is in the states. You've got a government that's continually spending too much money, more than that's being made. Um, I'm just looking at my notes here. So all this is being run by 20 or 30 people around the world, and they're determining how our governments are working. And these are the Masons of the world. Some people like to call them the Illuminati. And you can see these preparations for a world government or a world problem happening, because the United States is bringing in UN trucks. They're stockpiling them all over the United States of America, and they're creating these places called FEMA camps, um, things that places where they can contain people for upcoming disaster. And then you've got people like Putin, who is trying to take over, or has taken over, a problem in the Middle East. And at the same time, last year, I believe it was, or the last 2 years, he's been allowing his government to do urban warfare mock-up scenarios or training in the United States. So it's like he's playing both sides. He's pretending to be a world player, publicly in the news, where he's trying to stop problems in Syria, and then he's going along with these war games, bringing his troops over the United States. Now, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, whenever a king would allow another king to come in and see what was going on in Israel, you would later see a problem would happen. There would be an attack on Israel. And there are other examples of how a king brought people in to show off the wealth of the country, and then there was an attack and they lost it all. So it's it's like the government's trying to bring down the government from within itself, and allowing its enemies to see what they're capable of, and what kind of technology they have, and how even their soldiers fight. So you've got some really strange movements going on, and typically Russia and the United States aren't allies. So because you've got the Warsaw Pact, and you've got the NATO Pact, and these two pacts are, for people that don't know, are they're like two global forces acting against each other, made up of groups of nations in each pact. So you could say that the U.S. is trying to make peace with Russia, but that's fine. But then you would say, well, why are they trying to make peace, and why do we have urban warfare? Well, urban warfare would happen when the people of the countries of the world say, we don't want a one world order, and we're not putting up with this, and we're going to take our guns, and we're going to, I'm not saying I am, because I'd like to talk about the three different type of people that will react in the New World Order uprising. And actually read about that today in Revelation, and that's actually just for people who want to know. In Revelation, it talks about, in Revelation 13:9, it talks about basically the three types of people that will, or three types of behavior that will happen when the New World Order happens. But getting back to this, Black Horse era, or even Pale Horse era, if you want to amalgamate the two of them for this topic here, you're getting into a position where there's a lot of secret movements going on, and it just seems to fit the Black Horse era, in my opinion, where there's going to be financial unrest. And there's talk about in some people saying that the U.S. That Russia and China may in fact invade the U.S. West Coast and Canada someday, coming down through Alaska, because China secretly wants to have California, and Russia would very much like to take Alaska back. Alaska used to be controlled by Russia, believe it or not. It was a fishery and a fur trade state, you could say, owned by Russia. And I read an amazing book once back, a few years back, from our local library here, about how the different parts of Russia and India and Indonesia were explored by the English and the Dutch Trading Company. And the book later went on to tell about how Russia was exploring Alaska. So you've got these two allies, Russia and China, that are very much interested in working together, and they are now trading their oil in their own currencies. And for a long time, the U.S. has been using their own currency to dominate the oil market. So there's that's a really big thing lately, where China and Russia have been buying their oil with their own money and exchanging it with each other. So and probably likely other parts of the world. And so this, what I've been talking about actually is I had 3 parts of the sermon today, and you got a very large chunk actually in 13 minutes, and that was the first chunk. I hear pastors when they preach often say, "Well, I only got to the first part," or "There's still 2 or 3 other parts." But here we are. I've given you a lot of meat and potatoes here, and stuff to think about. I'd like to talk about God making a new earth, and how people must convert and repent. And these are my 2 other subsections here that I wanted to get to. And I promised that I would be shorter in my presentation this time around. So I just like to talk about God making a new earth, because really it's not all, we're talking about bad things happening, but the whole point is Jesus is coming back, and there has to be a bunch of stuff happen, right, in the world. So, God's making a new earth. He talks about that in Revelations 21. And I read about that today. Very exciting part, actually. And, he says here, Jesus says now, or I should say, John says, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared for the bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Verse 5, then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And let's just go on to say, and he said to me, write, for these things are true and faithful. And he said to me, it is done, and I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So really, we're sitting here talking about God and Jesus and the end times, and our push is for people to get saved and to understand the complexity of Revelation. And so all these bad things that we're talking about here in Revelation 6 are really so that something good can happen in verse 21 of Revelation, and for the Christians. And these are the Christians that are hot or cold, but not lukewarm. Okay? Because people must convert and repent according to Revelations basically 1 to 5. Right? And Jesus talks about the different types of churches in Europe in the time frame that it was written in, my understanding, and it applies to all people, right? I heard this said by a very interesting preacher, actually, on in the internet. It's got a really good series of books on the new, or the King James Version as a whole, unconverted. And he said that, that basically all the Bible applies to everyone, and Revelations written in the past applies to all people. And so it doesn't have to necessarily, I don't believe these verses here in the first part of Revelation our church today. How do I say this? Basically, I believe that this describes different types of churches that are happening all the time, right? It seems to kind of repeat itself. We've got different types of churches, but these are the churches that were back then and how they acted, and this is how God dealt with them. So that was something a little bit more than I wanted to talk about, but it's interesting to see, though, in Revelation 14 that there are two types of visits from Jesus, or heaven, I should say. One visit from Jesus in the first part, or the part of Revelation 14, deals with the rapture and how Jesus comes back and takes people away. Then you see a second part. This is a pretty technical part of Revelation, I would say. Chapter 14, verses 14 to 16, I believe, deal with Jesus coming in the clouds with his angels. But then it goes on in verse 17 of chapter 14 to verse 20, dealing with how a certain group of people are going to be punished or dealt with. And so you've got, in verse 14 it says, behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having his head a golden crown, and his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, thrust in your sickle and reap, for the first time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And so he who sat on the cloud thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now, in my opinion, that's Jesus coming in the clouds, taking people, right? And then in verse 17, it says, another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also having a sharp sickle. And it's funny when I think of this. I think of like a Grim Reaper type of figure. He's got the black hood on, and you can barely see his face, and he's got like this big knife and like shearing knife, right? And he's hacking at the you know the corn husks or the ground, right? And it's that scary image that you would typically see in the movies, like the movie Scream, or even in the Harry Potter movies where you've got those scary looking flying creatures trying to take over the castle in the last movie. And it's just so you've got these that really has nothing to, well, I should say nothing to do with it, but that's what I think about when I see this. But basically another angel comes out of the temple which is in heaven, and also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, who had the power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had a sharp sickle, saying, "Thrust in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of vine on the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth. And the vine, to me, are the lukewarm Christians. Right? These are the people that just really aren't Christians. And so the angel thrust his sickle in the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of wrath of God, which is hell. Okay, and I've seen a lot of evidence to this. And the winepress is trampled outside of the city, and the blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. So that's an area, right? And I could get in on what a furlong is, but you could Google it on the internet and it'll tell you. So basically, it sounds like a section of hell is now prepared, or it's going to be prepared for these people, right? And there's a lot of people, a lot of Christians. Now I've heard that the ratio of people getting to heaven is 1 to 1,000. So if you got 1,000 people in a courtyard, one person's getting in, Christians included, because of this whole cold person or warm person, a lukewarm person described about in the first 5 chapters of Revelation. I would encourage everyone to read that tonight or over the next week. So anyways, we're at 22 minutes and 38 seconds so far. And I would just like to, I guess that's going to be my conclusion, right? So go to church next Sunday and ask Jesus into your heart, and read the Bible at least once a week so you can grow your relationship with Jesus Christ. And until we talk again, thanks again, and have a good week.